Okay, so I was sitting behind my desk one afternoon and Father Sean came into my office and said, well, will you teach some of the adult forums? And I said, sure. And he said, well, which ones do you want to teach? And I said, well, you just tell me and I'll tell me which ones you need filling and I will teach them. And he said, well, okay. And then he handed me a list of titles and I saw that every single title was in some way relating to the Bible and relating to the book of Genesis. And I thought, ouch. Because Anglo-Catholics traditionally are not known for their biblical studies. And there's all kinds of jokes floating around about bishops showing up at Anglo-Catholic parishes and trying very hard and very unsuccessfully to find at least one Bible somewhere. So when I think back to my own education, my undergraduate work, my seminary work, I studied a lot of doctrine, a lot of church history, a lot of moral theology, lots and lots and lots of liturgy. I spent a semester studying an obscure aspect of Hinduism, but I have never studied the book of Genesis. And so the thought of researching Noah and the ark and the flood quite intrigued me, because it's one of those stories I've always felt as if I don't understand. Almost as if there's some kind of tension or divide in my mind as to what I should make of it all. On one hand, it's the cutest Sunday school story ever, right? We have arks, water, animals, doves, happy ending. It's perfect for children. We've all drawn pictures of it. We've all dressed up as sheep. But there's also something very dark, deep within that story. There's a completely different way you can look at it. So forget about the cuteness and the animals and the smiling faces on the ship. The story hinges on a horrible fact. The horrible fact that the world had gone wrong. So what did God decide to do about it? God decided to essentially put everything to death. God decided on a massacre. God decided on a huge killing on an epic scale. And then through that death and through that violence, peace would come once again and a new world would come to life. Does that sound familiar? Right? Think of our Holy Week journey. And God makes a covenant with Noah to never again destroy all flesh. And so creation itself is given a second chance. Now there's a lot more you can read into the story than just that. And in fact, the patristic fathers were fascinated with the intricate details of the narrative. So think, for example, about the people of Israel crossing through water in order to reach the promised land. They saw a parallel. Think about baptism. Think about the way that we are saved, and think about the relationship between the waters of the flood and the waters of baptism. Paul tells us that in baptism we're immersed into the death of Jesus. And then remember that Noah's ark did not escape the flood. It did not bypass the flood. It didn't find a way over it or beneath it. In fact, it traveled right through it. You know, the ark was immersed in the water of the flood like we as Christians are immersed in the water of baptism. Now, there's a lot more we could say about that, but for now, let's start in the state of Kentucky. Who has ever been to Kentucky? All right, I never have. Has anybody been to Grant County, Kentucky? No? I'm not surprised because I'm told that it's rather rural. But just a couple of months ago, in July of this year, in Grant County, Kentucky, something called Ark Encounter opened to great excitement. Ark Encounter is the work of a very wealthy group of evangelical creationists who arranged for this ark to be built, wait for it, to the precise measurements laid out in the book of Genesis. And the cost, $100 million. Now, the purpose of the exhibit, the purpose of Ark Encounter, is to tell the famous story. It's 98 verses in the book of Genesis. If you sit down this afternoon to read it, it will take you about 10 minutes. Briefly, and again, if you go to Ark Encounter, you can find this whole story told from start to end. It begins with all kinds of human atrocity, distancing the world from God. Murder, crime, and sexual relationships between angels and humans. And we're told something quite extraordinary in the book of Genesis chapter 6. We are told that God regretted creating mankind. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. That's quite extreme. God regretted his creation. That reflected the depth of human sin. So God tasked the only moral man left, the man called Noah, with preserving life in the catastrophe that God had decided would follow. And Noah would build a ship, he would bring 2 of every kind, rains would fall, waters would rise, everything not on that ship would perish. 1 year later, when waters recede, it would leave to Noah and everything on board that ship to repopulate the earth. What, I wonder, must life have been like on that ship? An 18th century English bishop liked to preach sermons comparing the ark to the church. And the 18th century English bishop liked to say that, like the church, only the storm outside could make the stench inside bearable. For the creationists in Kentucky, with their $100 million, the flood is foundational. The flood is a hinge of history. And so the world post-Eden was spinning out of control. It was righted by God's reign. And now it's spinning out of control again. That's their point. And that's why they poured so much time and money into their exhibit, as they hope it will stand as some kind of warning. A fresh call to save mankind all over again. And the warning is that secularism is itself a flood, that one day will sweep billions of us away. And so they created this ship. It's the largest freestanding timber frame building in the entire world. The Cincinnati Enquirer ran some numbers, and they say that from bow to stern, the ark would extend between the legs of the St. Louis Gateway Arch at its base. Set vertically, this ark would be slightly shorter than the Washington Monument. They built it using massive timbers of spruce and fir from New Zealand, and visitors to the ark say that it smells like a forest. Now, the interesting thing is that scientists tell us that there was never a global flood that consumed the entire planet. There may have been big floods, there may have been massive floods, and for people at that time, it may well have seemed that the entire world was being consumed, and so this story could have been something they would have related to. The brains behind Ark Encounter are not, of course, scientists, but it's interesting that within the creationist movement, there are some people who claim to be scientists, and there's a corresponding body of supposedly scientific literature. And so, for example, if you visit Ark Encounter, you would be told by scientists that the flood is responsible for the geological history of the earth. You would also be told how many animals were on the ship. And this is interesting. The word kinds is central to creationist biology. You know, we're told in the Bible that Noah brought 2 of every kind. Well, they would say that kinds do not refer to species, but kinds, in fact, refer to zoological borders. And so, for example, they say that donkeys, horses, and zebras are all part of the same kind. So there would not be 2 donkeys, 2 horses, and 2 zebras on the ark. There would in fact be a tokenary 2 representing what we might call the zoological family, right? Now they admit that new species can be introduced within kinds, but they're very clear that that does not mean evolution. So if you visit Ark Encounter, you would be told that 2 of every species did not have to fit on the ark. And in fact, they say, and I'm not sure how they reached this figure, but in fact, there were 1,400 kinds of animals on the ark, rather than the 2 to 5 million pairs that zoologists say the ark must have contained if this is something that actually happened. Another placard states at the park that there were definitely fewer than 6,700 animals on the ship. And so if you're wondering how Noah kept polar bears cool, well, the answer is he didn't, because there were no polar bears on the ark. The positive point of the Ark Encounter, I think, it's encouraging us to take this story seriously. In other words, this is more than a story for children. It's more than a good lesson for Sunday school. There's an adult version of Noah and the ark and the flood, and it bears contemplation and reflection. So let me share with you a couple of the points that jump out of this for me that I think bear contemplation and reflection. First of all, the divine decision to essentially wipe out the human race. with the exception of Noah and his family. Did God have the right to do that? Is that the action of a good and just and loving God? And it's not a far-fetched question. After all, we do not do things which countless others do not do. Okay? We're not all as bad as each other, right? So, I mean, I don't cook meth in the rectory, right? When I go to Trader Joe's, I pay for my groceries. I don't take the church silver and pay it and sell it on eBay, right? Now, I know that there are clergy somewhere out there that perhaps have done those things, okay? But why would God want to destroy me? Why would God want to destroy you, right? The answer that the Bible would give, I think, is they were understood not as individuals, but as a community. So sin infects not us as individuals, but us as an entire society. And so if something has gone wrong, the entire population in some way is accountable to God. If something bad is happening in France, or if something wrong is happening in California, then we're not excused by virtue of distance. So think, for example, of our liturgy on Ash Wednesday. And that sense that sin is not just something individual, but sin is also something corporate. And I think in some way in this strange story in Genesis, this is what we're being taught. Sin does not just infect us as individuals, it can corrupt and control an entire society. Now at that time, there were lots of stories and myths about gods, plural, causing floods. And the way that these myths would generally run is that a god would start a flood, and then when the flood started, the god responsible would panic. And then the other gods would come to that god's aid and would help the flood stop. And then once the flood had stopped, all the gods together would squabble. It's very strange. So given the fact that there is this competing body of literature at that time about gods and floods, notice the big differences in this account. In our account, there is only one God, right? And that God is in control. That God is majestic. That God does not need the help of any other God. And this God is calm. So if you take this story from the perspective of the history of religions, this is a very different kind of flood story. It's challenging the way we see the world. It's telling us to absorb the big picture. So think of a comparison from today. I watched CNN for about half an hour this morning at 5:30. And for 30 minutes, I heard about the 8 women that Donald Trump allegedly groped, right? But what's the news around the world? The news around the world is in Syria, or Iraq, or places where people as we speak are losing their lives in huge numbers. But that's not what's making the headlines. The point of this story is that we are supposed to absorb the big picture, and we are not supposed to be content with the world as it is. And Genesis describes a perfect world becoming a nightmare of violence and corruption through human rebellion and disobedience. And from that moment onwards, everything begins to collapse. That's the starting point for Noah's story. But even at that starting point, God is already preparing his plan of salvation. Right from day one, right from the moment that things begin to go wrong, God is quite literally devising a rescue plan. And God's eyes turn on Noah. Does something strike you about Noah in this story? And I read it, so I have an advantage over you. There's something unusual about Noah. He doesn't say a single word. In all those 98 verses, he is an utterly silent man. There are no words from his lips because this is a story about God. And so before God begins the torrential rain, his rescue plan is already in place. It will be a flood to wash away violence and hatred and bigotry. We are told in chapter 5 that Noah has been picked out from birth to play his part in creation in a new beginning. It's that sense again of somebody being picked from birth. Think of John the Baptist. Think of the Virgin Mary. God creating these plans when people are still resting in the womb. It's not as if they're cast as survivors following a nuclear bomb. We don't get that sense that the flood ends and they're somehow resting on a desert island, wondering what on earth they should do next. When Noah and his family and the kinds of animals emerge from the ship, there is this sense of blessing. There is a sense that life is beginning again. This is something more than survival. This is recreation. This is renewal. Dare I say it, this is a prototype of resurrection. Now God admits, and this is interesting, God admits, even post-flood, that evil and sin have not gone away. The point of the flood was not to eradicate the world of evil. Instead, it's something positive. Through the flood, we see the emergence of grace. In spite of sin and evil, God makes his covenant. The rainbow is God's promise to never destroy us again. It's a guarantee, if you like, that God will protect us from ourselves. And it's a rainbow that leads next to the cross and then on to Easter. Let me end with my favorite part of the story. It's the part that you don't hear in the Sunday school classes. When it was all over, and Noah became the first tiller of the fresh soil, what, are we told, did Noah do next?
But planted grapes, made wine, and got drunk.
He got drunk. What did he do when he got off the ship? The Bible tells us he got really drunk. And I've thought about that a lot. It's not the kind of thing that you expect to read in the Bible, especially from the person that we're told was the only blameless person on earth, right? Why did Noah get drunk? Was he very happy to be off the ship? Maybe. Was he celebrating a successful voyage? Maybe. Was he celebrating survival? Maybe. Was he escaping the memory of 12 months on a rickety ship with 2 animals of every kind? Possibly. But I have another thought. I don't think he was escaping the past, and I don't think he was escaping the future. I think Noah was bowled over with the enormous responsibilities of the present. He had the responsibility of rebuilding life. He had the responsibility of rebuilding a life that this time would be just and peaceful. And of course, that's exactly what he goes on to do. So the story ends, I think, by reminding us of the virtue of courage. And reminding us all the way through this story that God always equips us to do what he calls us to do. God does not call when God does not equip. If God sets a task before us, God will find a way for us to be able to do that task, even if it means we astonish ourselves. So there was no need for Noah to get drunk, although I don't think we can blame him after it. Right? So I'm going to turn this off if I can figure out how, and then if anybody has any questions or thoughts,